This is the Sales Babble Podcast, episode 368, Frictionless Selling, an interview with Anthony Coundouris.
Welcome to Sales Babble, the podcast that shares selling secrets for non-sellers. And now your host, Pat Helmers.
Hello, Sales Babblers. This is Pat Helmers. And in this episode, we meet Anthony Coundouris, author of Run Frictionless, a book that helps founders scale an organization that backfills their sales role. Anthony does this by using a decision-making framework, which he calls the 4 Qs. Anthony and I walk through those 4 Qs, and he shares advice on how to remove an organization's friction from the prospect's buying experience. Now, if you're frustrated with the barriers that make it hard for your customers to buy, this episode gives direction on what to focus on and how to make buying as seamless and easy as possible at your company. But before we get to the interview, here is a message from our sponsor. Sales Babble is sponsored by Habanero Media, a podcasting agency that produces B2B interview-based podcasts. A podcast is the premier way for a business to boost its brand, authority, influence, and trust. With podcasts, companies grow revenue by meeting influencer and prospects through the interview process. If you've ever thought about starting a podcast to grow your business, go to habaneromedia.net for advice, help, and classes on how to start a B2B podcast. That's habaneromedia.net with an H. And so, with no further ado, let's get to it. Welcome, Anthony. Are you ready to babble?
Ready to babble, baby.
Anthony, you have a new book out. It's titled Run Frictionless, How to Free a Founder from a Sales Role. Got it in my hand right now. Why did you write this book, and what do you mean, how to free a founder from a sales role?
Initially, the book was written, Patrick, as a tool for myself, for me. So I read it as a tool to solve my own problem. My profession, what I do for a living, is I build sales processes for companies in Asia Pacific. And I needed a framework, I needed a book, like a set of notes that I could hand a customer before we got started working together so that they had some sense of what was coming. You know, the education process can take a long time. And when you've only got maybe 60, 90 days to show results, I didn't really feel like losing 30 days in education. So that's where the book came in.
So I'm assuming then your clients are people who are doing all the selling, and the services that you're trying to provide them is to get them out of that and to actually build some kind of sales processes that entail other staff, I assume, right?
Yeah, quite often when people promise me, sales directors, CEOs, that they promise me that there's a sales process in place. And the reality is that in most situations when I begin working with companies, if you call it, say, sales process or sales system version 1.0, really doesn't exist. It's a set of completely disorganized interactions, which every person in the business is doing it differently. And over time, the problem with that is that it makes it really difficult to make an improvement, because if Tom, Dick, and Harry all have a different way of selling, when you sit down with them to talk about an improvement, it's really difficult to roll it out.
Right. I see that. And in fact, another thing that I see in this is a lot focused towards tech. I see a lot of SaaS. I see a lot of startup in this book. That's your clients?
Yeah, it is. In fact, strangely enough, 50% of our customer base is actually professional services, consulting businesses using the framework, reading the book, and then applying the 4 Qs framework. And then probably the balance would be, internet startups.
So what about this title, though? Run Frictionless. It almost seems like what that title says is there's friction in the selling process, and you want to overcome that. Why do you think that's true?
Yeah. So friction is any obstacle that slows a customer from reaching their goal and equally slows the company from making a sale. And when we remove friction, not only do we improve the buying experience, but we create sales. In fact, the premises that friction's based upon is rather than focusing necessarily on individual sales performance, like the individual salespeople, I'll go to work to try to drive down friction within the organization. And what we've found is that if we succeed, we can double, sometimes even triple the revenue of a business within 3 to 5 months, especially companies that have been operating for more than 5 years.
That's awesome. That's
Yeah,
awesome. So then it goes to, in the book, you mentioned this before, kind of the process that that I see in this book is something that you call the four Qs.
right.
What are they? What are the four Qs?
Yeah, so this comes to the basis now of how we deal with friction. So if you agree that friction is not necessarily a sales problem, it's in fact an organizational issue, and that just pushing it to the salespeople and making sales entirely their responsibility. If you think about friction, it's really a problem that exists within the whole company. And so the framework is really, really important because what it does is it opens up, if you like, four windows or four quadrants, um, opens up four windows or four quadrants, which demonstrate or illuminate value that can be created for a customer. So one of the very first things that the four Qs does is if you look at it, it's okay. It's structured in four quadrants: who we serve, what we serve, who we are, and lastly, how we serve. And what's really cool about it is, so sometimes when people are introduced to it for the very first time, they will realize that their company might be only running on one or two quadrants and that there's a whole bunch of value that their company could be delivering to a customer that they're not doing right now. So that's one of the things that's really interesting is how it illuminates opportunity to create additional value, but it also gives a framework for grouping people and processes. So if you take your people and processes across the organization and group them into one or more of these four quadrants, you can be guaranteed that those people are now directly touching a customer. And what's very, I suppose, again, illuminating is that some people in the business think that they don't serve customers, but once they are orientated to understand how they fit within the four Qs, they rapidly discover that they indeed do serve customers. And when we say customers, most of the time we're talking about like an external customer, typically the customer who's paying for your goods and services. But in some situations, I've been schooled by some consultants who are using the four Qs, and they've shown me how you can also think about a customer as being an internal customer as well. It equally applies.
What I liked about this was this whole idea of service, because a lot of companies, they're more ego centered. Like it's all about my stuff, my solutions, how awesome they are. I'm surprised people aren't more jumping on and buying them, as opposed to there's customers out there, clients out there that are struggling with problems. They got challenges, and I need to help them. I need to serve them. And that's what I liked about that. It goes to this whole idea. I love the idea of frictionless, because we also hear this in marketing, right? Like you want to have a frictionless sale so
Yep.
that people don't abandon the shopping cart, that it's as easy as possible for them to put their credit card, put their PayPal in, right? It's all that same idea, very centered on the buyer.
Yeah, friction is really interesting. You can have friction which is that the customer's facing. That's, typically they'll say things like, it's too hard, or listen, I'll contact you next month, because you're making the situation so difficult for them to purchase that the energy required in order to purchase the product exceeds the perceived value that they'll get from the product. And when that happens, when that equation is balanced in that way, you get exactly what you talked about, which is either you can call it drop off or some call it cart abandonment. And friction is not just a problem that the customer feels, because it's also something that the salespeople talk about, like internal friction that they're facing. They feel like their wheels are spinning, or you can get the best
Yeah.
salesperson
Yeah.
from another organization and poach them and put them into the worst sales process where you've got a really high degree of friction, like your friction quotient is really high compared to another organization in your in your competition sphere, and that person will tank. They'll complain that they can't hit their numbers because it's too hard for them to do it.
Yes. I've been in that situation where I feel like not only am I battling, the cold call and trying to get to the prospective client, but I'm battling my own company who's putting up all these barriers and making it hard to
Yeah,
sell.
Tom Williamson, who wrote the Biocentric, he wrote a book on biocentricity. He's in the States. When I talked to him about, he read the book, and he talked a lot about internal friction and dysfunction within organizations, and how by having a lot of internal friction, that then leads to creation of external friction for the customer, and how difficult it is then to solve that external friction if you do have, as you put it, these internal barriers. There's a few interesting aspects of friction that we've been able to nail. A few things that we've figured out along the way, some fun facts, if you like. Like, for instance, friction has a quotient. We can measure the degree to which your organization has more friction. How much friction did you introduce into the sales process, say, compared to your nearest and furthest competitors? We also figured out that friction accumulates. That means it's not a one-time experience. It accumulates as the customer engages and interacts through the early, the middle, and the end game with your organization. And we also discovered as well that you're making a really big mistake if you think it's a problem for the salespeople to solve, because just like you've iterated today, um, those kinds of barriers that they're facing are often got nothing to do with the sales department, the sales organization. They can be in other departments. And that's why the 4Qs framework is a really good tool to use to go to develop a culture, right? A culture within the business to drive down and eliminate friction. I like to convert every person in the organization into hunters, and we all collectively go out and just hunt down friction.
This kind of speaks to this whole idea, that's on top of mind in a lot of companies, is the idea of customer experience, which is just a fancy way of saying better customer support.
Yeah, one of the quadrants, which is quadrant 4, how we serve, specifically targets customer experience. And I think what's really important with the framework is um, it draws a distinction between the idea of brand and who we are, like those shared beliefs, versus what customer experience really is. Because quite often these words get muddled and mixed. And I think in the organizations that I've built in the past, we'll build the company, right? We'll write the business plan. We'll start getting customers. We'll design a product. We'll start selling the product, and then right at the end, we'll say, "Oh, we better put in some customer experience. We can check that box too." So quickly, let's just put that on. Let's just tack that onto the end of the business as well. And it's almost like the reason we used to do that was because we were just told by a TechCrunch article that if you have customer experience, it's a good thing. But what I figured out while writing this book and implementing, there's 150 companies now using the 4Qs. And one of the really interesting parts of customer experiences was, frankly speaking, I used to think it was just BS, right? And what we realized was it's not. It's like customer experience is directly correlated to sales. So if you drive down friction, which improves customer experience, sales directly correlates with customer experience. The two track one another positively. Now, I hadn't seen that before. I used to think it was like a nice to have. Now it's a must have.
I could totally see this because, especially in a client based world, you want your customers to be sticky. You don't want them to leave. And if this onboarding experience they have is really great, as the ownership of the service is positive, you're much more likely to be able to upsell them other things down the road. You're much more likely to get a terrific reference out of them, a great quote and testimonial. You're much more likely to get a great referral out of them. Friends of theirs, a lot of these people have moved around from company to company. They know other people who may be having similar challenges in their companies. This all will go to the bottom line. This will all grow revenue. I can totally see this.
Just generally speaking, if you look at the 4 Qs, quadrant 1 is the customer profile, quadrant 2 is the product, quadrant 3 is the brand, quadrant 4 addresses customer experience. And quite often when I ask an organization, show me what your set of customer interactions look like. What is the minimum number of customer interactions required to create a customer in quadrant 4? Show me what they look like right now. And most businesses can't show them to me. And what's also very interesting is there's no budget for quadrant 4. So they'll pour all the cash into quadrant 2, the product, which, by the way, the customer hasn't experienced yet because they haven't bought it, right? They're still thinking about making a buying decision. They don't know whether your product's any good or not. And in fact, the only cues that they have to the quality of quadrant 2 is based on the branding in quadrant 3 and whether or not you're able to serve them in an expedient manner in quadrant 4, or whether you're able to surprise and wow them. Because it's quite irrational, the decision-making that's going on, or the buying forces that operate in 3 and 4, because as rational as we think people buy based on attributes from quadrant 2, the buying decisions that we've been seeing, 70% of the influence, even in B2B, is coming from quadrants 3 and 4. And that's because people say to themselves, for example, let's just take the customer experience, right? At quadrant 4, they say to themselves, wow, if they serve me this well right now, imagine how awesome the product's going to be. That's what's going on in their mind, right? And now they're getting towards the end game where they've got to make a buying decision, right? And you've got these bunch of fellas who are competing on, trying to compete with apples based on product attributes. And what's going on in the back of their mind is one organization stands out from the pack because it's like they're the guys that just seem to be so fast and frictionless, and the product's going to be really, really awesome.
There's a couple things going on here, I think. In my experience, this is what I kind of call it the Inventors Dilemma. They have this baby of theirs that they really love, this thing that they built, this hunk of software or something. And it's what they know. So they're constantly polishing it. They're constantly working on that. And they don't think twice of putting money into that. Meanwhile, the whole selling thing is something they don't love. They didn't go to school to do. They studied engineering or something else, right? And it's just kind of natural for them to want to put money there. And then I also see I've worked with some people who are very transactional, and they're like, well, we don't want to have a lot of great support. We don't want to have a great customer experience. Let's put a lot of barriers and make it really hard for them to talk to our people. Let's make them jump through a hoop, and they have to use email only. They can't chat with us. They can't talk to us on the phone. So you have this like long experience of like trying to fix something, when in reality, what I've seen great organizations do is they're talking to these people on the phone, and they're immediately getting feedback on what's wrong with the software, and they're immediately feeding that back to the development organization and fixing it so that people never complain about that issue again. Most people just don't have that maturity.
This is sales babble, Patrick. No, but you make a sound point. In the book Run Frictionless, I talk about you might remember the chapter that describes quadrant 2, what we serve, and I talk about an archetype called the quadrant 2 fanatic. It's the person who just has to work on the product night and day, and I remember working with one organization where 5 days a week, it's all we did. And I said, look, can we just have one day a week where we don't talk about quadrant two? I don't want to hear about your features and your APIs and everything. I just want to talk about, let's talk about our beliefs, or let's describe the set of interactions required to create a customer, and so you'll get typically technically led founders, technically led CEOs who will only put emphasis, cash, resources into quadrants one and two, and will just ignore three and four at their own peril. This is a really serious problem for them, because if I go into an industry, quite often we're asked to do what's called a friction test. So, coming back to these, friction has a quotient. A startup or even an enterprise organization that's been around for a while will ask us to study their closest and furthest competitors and rate benchmark the friction in each of those organizations. And one of the things that's very interesting that we look for is this an industry where nobody's putting any emphasis in quadrants 3 and 4? Because if they're not, they're ripe to be hit by a startup. And this is where you'll get enterprise companies that put a lot of money into 1 and 2, and they will ignore 3 and 4. And then all of a sudden you'll get a startup that will come in that has a product that's not as good, that's not technically superior, that has less features, but has got some awesome experiences that the customer can have right at the beginning during the sales process. And they achieve what we call a far better quadrant 1-4 fit. They've gone into quadrant 1, they've designated a very specific customer profile they want to serve. They've now got a series of experiences just for that customer profile. And now that customer is hypnotized by this organization and is ignoring the enterprise business, which has been around far longer and has a far better product. So there's a real danger in ignoring 3 and 4 because you're opening yourselves up to. In fact, when I work with enterprise, one of the things we try to do is put more money, more resources into 3 and 4 as a defense against startups. So that's something to be conscious of.
People want to know you've got their back. And even I see this all the time. I've done this myself as a buyer. It may not be the most perfect thing out there, but I like the people, and I feel like they'll figure it out. They got my back if I buy them.
The thing that's interesting about the people aspect of companies is that, and I think that's why quadrant 3, if I may touch upon that a little bit, maybe I can describe some of the aspects of shared beliefs, because I think that that's quite important to how startups scale their business. At one point they're going to need to hire more people, and part of no longer being the person who's doing all the selling, like the founder that's always doing all the selling, is you're trying to scale yourself out of the business one quadrant at a time. And so what quite often happens is, if you take those quadrant 2 fanatics, is they're really good at 1 and 2 and they're dismal in 3 and 4. And so quite often what the recommendation could be is, well, that's where your co-founder is going to be. Don't hire people to come into your business. You can give them any title you want. You can give them the Director of Operations Worldwide Global. You call them whatever title tickles them. But you say to them, look, here is a bunch of projects and people that we manage within quadrants 3 and 4. That's what I need to get done. If you want 20% of my business, if you want to take 20% of the company as a co-founder, that's what I'm going to need from you. I need you to operate 3 and 4. I need you to make them work. And now you're scaling yourself out of the business, because coming back to what the 4 Qs illuminates is value that touches directly to a customer. So if you're able to extricate yourself from one of those by no longer being the quadrant leader, either because you're grooming staff to become the quadrant leader, or you've been smart enough to hire the right kind of co-founder who's going to cover those quadrants where you're not as motivated or perhaps not as technically savvy, you're scaling yourself out of the business so that you can work on the business.
I love it. If people want to connect with you, Anthony, what's the best way of doing that?
Head to runfrictionless.com. You can tune in, and we can do a virtual coffee there if you hit the homepage, or of course you can find Anthony Coundouris on LinkedIn.
And your book is on Amazon?
It is. It's on Amazon. You can find the book either by going to Amazon, or if you can, you go to runfrictionless.com. There's a bread trail there to Amazon.
If you could give our listeners one quick tip, piece of advice they could take action on this week, what would that be?
I think that I would reassess your product. And when I think about quadrant 2, quite often when people write product fact sheets, they write the specification for quadrant 2 of the product. They only think about the features. So they'll just sit down and write all the things that it can do. I would encourage our listeners, Patrick, to think about the limitations, what it can't do, and then map those limitations to workarounds. And if you do that, if you take that advice and you go 3 levels rather than 1 level into quadrant 2, you will be doing what your competitors fail to do. And by doing that, if you go that extra mile of addressing the limitations of the product, but also then mapping the known workarounds to those limitations, you'll create a stronger quadrant 1-2 fit. You'll improve the confidence of your salespeople. Your dialogue on the telephone will sound something like this. Before Sally even explains or asks the question about whether the product does that or not, Tom can jump straight in and go, Sally, it doesn't do that, but we've got these awesome workarounds, steps 1, 2, 3. This is how you do it, because there is no piece of perfect software. There is no product out there that can do everything. Really savvy buyers know that if you keep saying yes to every question that they ask, that you're BS.
It's baloney.
But if you can jump in straight away and go, limitation, workaround, you demonstrate that this is not the first day that you sold the product. And heck, I've been in startups where it is the first day. But if we map it really clearly and we have that confidence where we can jump in and anticipate the question, the customer can quite often live with the workaround.
Yeah, I've totally seen that to be true. This is terrific advice, Anthony. I really appreciate you visiting here on Sales Babble and Babbling with us. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Patrick, pleasure's mine. Thank you.
So last week with Harry Mills, we did friction-free influencing, and here this week we're doing run frictionless in terms of frictionless buying. This whole idea of friction has really got some legs this year, doesn't it? It's hard enough prospecting and getting a customer to agree to a sales call. Why make it all the more harder for them to buy once they make a decision? Anything you can do to smooth that operation, the better. So to connect with Anthony, you can find links to him and his book in the show notes at www.salesbabble.com. If you could like, share, and subscribe this episode, that would be really great on no matter whatever podcast app that you're using at this time. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode or any other episode, don't hesitate to reach out on LinkedIn or send us an email or go to salesbabble.com and click the Babble Me button. That's all we've got for this week, folks. Until next week, take care and have a highly productive and a profitable selling day.
Thank you for listening to the Sales Babble podcast. Find us at www.salesbabble.com.
This is a production of Habanero Media.